Today my guest is author Kathleen McGowan, and we will be talking to her about her new novel, The Poet Prince, from Touchstone, a division of Simon & Schuster. Now, among other books, Kathleen is the New York Times bestselling author of The Book of Love and The Expected One, and there are over 500,000 copies of her books in print in the United States, and rights have been sold in over 30 countries. That is amazing. And she will be speaking to us from her home in Los Angeles. So, Kathleen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Well, it's really incredible how well you've done with your books and your series, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about various things. But first of all, give an overview of the story.
Well, I write a series. The Poet Prince is the third book in a series, and the series is about women and events in history, essentially, that have been either completely misunderstood, misrepresented, or forgotten. So my crusade is to go out and find these amazing characters in history who have changed the world, and yet maybe we don't know that about them. Find these events in history that had an impact on our lives 1,000 years ago but still affect us today, and maybe we don't know what that is. And I tend to take a spiritual and a sociological perspective on those events. So it started out initially as a book about women in history who had been completely misunderstood. And I originally was an investigative journalist, and I set out to write a nonfiction book back at the end of the 80s. In the early 90s, I was doing this investigative research in all these women who we tend to think of as notorious, whether it's Lucretia Borgia or Marie Antoinette, women who had a certain reputation. And I set out to kind of avenge them and defend them and say, let's look at them differently. And along the way, I realized it's not just women, but it's also men who have been maligned and misunderstood in history.
Well, absolutely, and we're going to get into, details about it. I think the next thing that I'd like my listeners to hear from you is the fact that this book is amazing in that it includes history, art history, religion, literature. I think my listeners would find it interesting as to how in the world did you research all of this for The Poet Prince in particular, but your other books.
Researching The Poet Prince is the newest of the books, and The Poet Prince, just so that they have an idea, is about the birth of the Renaissance in Florence. So it's about what really was behind this extraordinary movement of art and culture and also social revolution that was happening in Europe at the time. And the Poet Prince refers to Lorenzo de Medici, who was the godfather of this Renaissance. He was the patron of all of these artists. And so he is the Poet Prince. He is the force. He is the leader behind changing the world. And, of course, it's never a terrible hardship to have to do research in Florence.
Well, no, of course not. But how did you actually do it while you were there? What did you do to get all of this background?
Well, my method is something that I call beyond the books. So I do all of my due diligence. I read all the traditional books about history and about art, and then I go beyond that. I then go out and I get really, involved in the situations. Now, in Florence, of course, you have to spend a lot of time in art galleries because you're writing about art. And The Poet Prince is also about the fact that these artists in the Renaissance were incredibly special. They had an understanding of art and of creating art that is not about the visual alone. It's also about infusing energy and intention and spirit into the paintings. So I spent a lot of time in front of these paintings really trying to experience them and discovered some amazing things, like the Botticelli room in the Uffizi Museum is an extraordinary place, but they've had all kinds of unusual events happen there. They've had people faint. They've had people really, have strange experiences in there because the energy of all that Botticelli art in one place is extremely overpowering.
Well, I have heard that from friends and acquaintances that have traveled to Florence, that just being in Florence and walking through the streets and everything has created that fainting spells and all of what you're referring to.
It's absolutely true. And there are pockets on the planet that are like that, but I think Florence is just so heavily concentrated. You can feel the energy when you walk down the street. The history is just alive in Florence and throughout Tuscany. So I knew that in order to really capture these events and really understand them, I had to immerse myself in the research. And so I stayed in this place called the Antica Torre, which is the ancient tower, which is a 13th century building right on the river, which has been converted into a very small, very beautiful hotel. And that was my home in Florence while I was doing the research. So I immersed myself in history everywhere I went all day long so that I could really, really, really feel it. So when I got down to writing it, I had as much of a sense of it as was humanly possible.
Well, now, were you there alone, or did you go with family or acquaintances?
I have done both because I have been doing this research now, that particular research in Florence, over about a 5-year period.
Uh-huh.
So there were times when I was there with my kids, and then there were times when I was there just by myself. When I went to the Antiquatore the last time to finish the book, I stayed there for several weeks and just immersed myself in it. And what I would do is I would get up every morning and I would walk along the river and I would go visit the statues of Lorenzo de Medici and just get my sort of, Florence breakfast into my energy. And then I would go and I would start working on the book.
Now, this is an obvious question, but I want to see how you answer it, because while you were there and while you were in Florence and doing all of this, and while writing the story, how did the time you spent in Italy inspire you creatively as well as spiritually?
Oh, it's impossible not to be inspired when you are in the presence of that much art. And when you also realize that the people who created it were so inspired. And that's what I was trying to get to. I was trying to get to, who were the muses for these extraordinary artists? Who was inspiring them, the men and the women who made them want to create art? So a lot of what I was doing was about understanding this whole concept of the muse, how someone inspires you to create something. But the other thing that I realized through this process that I think is the most important, and the reason that I ultimately wrote this book this way, is that Lorenzo de Medici and these artists were trying to change the world. They wanted to create a golden age of beauty because they were coming out of a dark age. And I think that that's a really interesting metaphor for us in the 21st century. I think that we're coming out of a really dark period and that we want to create a golden age and that we can do it. But we need to find inspiration. So for me, writing about these people who created the Renaissance was my inspiration, and I wanted to share that inspiration with others.
And did what you find, did that inspire you as far as your spiritual life?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of what I write about spiritually is the fact that there has always been, for 2,000 years, there has always been a kind of shadow, hidden aspect of Christian spirituality and Gnosticism that was completely separate from the church. And it was very pure, and it was very much about faith and community and charity. And these artists were immersed in it. And so a lot of what's painted is essentially heretical. A lot of what they paint is their own sort of beautiful but heretical beliefs, which they can present in art, but you couldn't necessarily write about because it would be death from the church to write about it.
Well, that's right. This is a good time, I think, since we're talking about spirituality and so forth, that I've read a reference or two to your books as being, and I may not be quoting this properly, but the meaning was that they're quasi-spiritual. What do you think is meant by that?
Well, I think that I don't think they're quasi-spiritual. I think that they are spiritual.
Yeah.
They're meant to be. My books are difficult to categorize. Bookstores never really know where to put me. Am I a thriller? Am I a mystery? Is it a spiritual book? Because I do tie all of those things together.
Yeah, maybe that's what they mean by it. Do you think so?
Yeah,
Since they can't.
I think it has long been hard. I know Borders and Barnes & Noble are always wrestling with where exactly to put my books because they're kind of crossovers. There's a lot of information in them. But aside from the traditional sort of thriller journey, I want to write page turners. I want you to be excited about what you're reading. I want it to be something that you can't put down. But I also try to infuse all of my research. I've done 20 years of research into this aspect of hidden Christianity and how it has been protected, especially in France and Italy, by these extremely famous people who actually took huge risks to protect their spiritual beliefs. So I always weave that very, very much into the books. The second book, The Book of Love, is all about this idea that these people believe that there was once a gospel written in Jesus' own hand, which they called the Book of Love.
Yes.
And this is an idea that most people have never even heard of. Most people have never even heard of this possibility that Jesus may have authored a gospel. And that was so fascinating to me when I first discovered it in 1995 that I said, wow, I've got to write about this. No one's ever even heard of it. And yet, it's a fairly well-known thing, particularly in the southwest of France.
Well, now you say you've been doing this for 20 years. Do you have a background in art or religion or history, or what? Where did all of this come from? Just as a journalist, an investigative
it just
journalist?
came from, it kind of found me. I started out, like I said, I did have a background in history, investigative journalism. I was writing about history, particularly European history, when I was younger, and as I started to dig, I just really fell in love with these subjects, and the art kept pulling me back in.
Sure.
Because I discovered that there was so much information in the art, and I still, there's not a day that goes by, because this research is, never ending. It goes on every single day for me. When I don't discover some extraordinary painting or fresco or piece of architecture that holds some extraordinary symbolism that hasn't necessarily been looked at close enough. And so, it just became a matter of passion. I just became passionate about everything that I was discovering and how it was changing me. And I found that every time I shared it with somebody else, it would change them as well.
Well, it's an amazing period of history. As you say, they were trying to create this golden age of beauty, and to read about it and to see the paintings must have been just an extraordinary experience for you.
Oh, there's absolutely nothing like living the history. And then when you get out of the larger museums and start getting into the smaller places, the beauty of Florence is that the churches in Florence are just like museums. You have priceless pieces of artwork on the walls of so many of the churches, and it's free. It's available to the public. People can just come and go and just be in the presence of this extraordinary inspiration all the time.
Well, and of course, unless you read about this period of history, a lot of tourists, a lot of people, a lot of Americans probably don't even realize that that's why all of this art was created.
Absolutely.
Actually.
Well, it's and a good example of that is there's so much angelic portrayal in the Renaissance portraiture. We always look at all the Renaissance angels. There's angels in all the paintings. And we think, okay, they're beautiful and they're lovely and there's little cherubs. But when you start digging into what these people believed and what these painters were doing, angels were a very, very powerful force in their everyday life. They prayed to angels. They invoked angels. Some of them believe that they were the voice of angels. Remember that Michelangelo's name means the Archangel Michael. Right.
Now, again, for those listeners that are not familiar with the period, what period of time was this in the reign of the Medicis that you're referring to?
Well, Lorenzo was born in 1449. His grandfather, Cosimo de Medici, is really the first great pioneer. He is the one who starts all of this, and Lorenzo is his grandson who takes it over and then really takes it to the next level. So we're talking about the middle of the 1400s till the end of the 1400s, which is the real golden age of Florence. And Cosimo de Medici is an amazing character who was doing all kinds of things. He was the first person to defend artists' rights. He was the first person to stand up and say, it is a terrible thing to cheat an artist or not to pay an artist. He was the first person to say, we need to leave these artists alone and let them live any way that they want. There was a huge scandal around some of the artists using male nudes as models.
Yeah.
And Donatello was one of them, and Donatello was in tremendous trouble for making a beautiful piece of art around a nude male.
Oh, that famous statue of David.
His famous young David.
That all of the women fall in love with.
It's a beautiful statue. And Cosimo de Medici actually went to the Signoria in Florence and said, how dare you judge this man and what he finds to be his muse? If his muse is a beautiful young man and that causes him to create beautiful art, you need to be grateful that he has found beauty in that. And it was incredibly progressive. And just being in California, in the last year with a lot of the things that have happened here politically, it's amazing to me to look at what happened in Florence 500 years ago, how progressive they were socially.
Let's go into a few more details about the Medicis, briefly.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Medicis really became my poster boys for the maligned and misunderstood men of history, and that was really, it was in researching them that I decided it's not just women, it's men who also need some defense here. Because when you say Medici, particularly to an American audience, what you mostly get in response is, oh, they were tyrants, they were a crime family. People tend to think of them in this really oppressive way. And even if you look at the basic history books, it'll talk about Cosimo de Medici and Lorenzo de Medici and how they, kept their artists locked up and made them paint and treated them in this terrible way. And absolutely none of that is true. In fact, the more you dig into the Medici, the more you realize how incredibly progressive they were. And remember, history is written by the victors, right? History is written by the winners. And in this case, history was written by the church in a lot of respects as well. So the Medici were enemies of the church. In fact, the Pope tries to murder Lorenzo in the cathedral on Easter Sunday with a team of hitmen. So there is, what you're going to find is the way that history is recorded is going to have a point of view or an agenda. And that's what I say in my very first book, and it's probably the thing that I am most quoted for, is my character who's investigating history says, history is not what happened, history is what was written down. And there is a huge difference. In the case of the Medici, history was often written down by their enemies. So they're depicted in this terrible way, when in fact, when you start digging into the real stories, you have people like Donatello begging to be buried at the feet of Cosimo when he dies. This is not something that an artist does who's been abused. This is a sign of devotion. These artists loved these men, and that's why I wanted to really dig into these stories and find out what was at the heart of people lying about the Medici. And I think the fact that the Medici were social progressives is one of the reasons that the more conservative people of Italy later wrote about them in this dark way.
Now, you have two main characters in the book, Maureen how do you pronounce her last name? Pascal. And you have the poet, her lover, Berenger Sinclair, right? And they go about trying to solve certain mysteries.
Right.
And then they find, who was history's great poet prince?
Well, I believe that history's greatest poet prince is Lorenzo de Medici, which is why I write about him as the poet prince. But he was certainly not the first. There were a number of people who fall into this category of poet prince, and there is even an argument to be made that Jesus was a poet prince.
Right.
So, if we want to look at it that way, then we say, of course, Jesus would have been the first poet prince, because this is a title that comes from an ancient prophecy about men who will change the world by combining compassion with power and poetry and beauty. And so that's the legacy of the poet prince, and we certainly could use one of those now.
Yeah, that's for sure. How much of the main character, Maureen, is based on yourself or like yourself? I
would say a fair amount. So I always say to people that Maureen isn't me, but she certainly has had a lot of my experiences. Mm-hmm. And that's when I originally started out to write this series, I thought it was important to go back and forth in time so you could see how these events from long ago are really still very important to us today. So I wanted to show the contrast, but also the connections between the past and the present, which is why my books slip back and forth in time. Mm-hmm. And so Maureen is essentially having the experiences that I had in terms of discovering so many of these things.
For those listeners who may not be familiar with your two books, earlier books, why does Maureen set out to seek these answers?
Well, rather like I did. Mm-hmm. Maureen is an investigative journalist. She's also writing a book about the women of history who have been maligned and misunderstood.
Okay.
And that journey takes her to the south of France, which is what happened to me in 1995. I went to the south of France to investigate the legacy of Mary Magdalene in Europe. Because, again, it's one of those things that Americans are not terribly familiar with this idea, but it's extremely commonplace in France. Throughout Europe, actually, this idea that Mary Magdalene came to France following the crucifixion and essentially set up her own church and her own mission. There are so many legends about what she did when she arrived in Europe. She set up homeless shelters. She set up schools. She has this tremendous legacy. She really is the first lady of spirituality for most of Europe. And yet in America, we still think of her as the reformed prostitute. Uh-huh. And so for me, arriving in France and seeing that she is not only everywhere, but she is revered, she is worshipped as a messianic figure in France was really transformational for me because, again, this is the idea of history is not what happened, history is what is written down. And yet American biblical scholars will say, well, there's no proof that Mary Magdalene was in France because it's not in the Bible, and we don't have any documented evidence for it. But when you are in France and you see it everywhere, and you see it in the architecture and you see it in the art, I mean, going back to the first century, you know there's something really powerful going on here. And so I ultimately came to the conclusion that Mary Magdalene was so important that she really is the poster girl for the fact that all of history in the last 2,000 years has been completely manipulated. And she became my real muse. She became the reason that I had to write. I had to tell the story of this extraordinary, courageous, beautiful woman who threatened the church so badly with her power that by the time we reached the early Middle Ages, there was a crusade against her descendants, which is essentially a genocide, and almost 1 million people were wiped out for believing exactly in that heresy that Mary Magdalene came to France and started her own church.
Wow. Well, what do you add more in the book in terms of her relationship to Jesus? Or
Yes,
do you
absolutely. My first book, The Expected One, is very much about the life of Mary Magdalene from that point of view. And that's why it was certainly the most controversial of the books, because I am very strongly of the point of view that she was married to Jesus and that she did have his children, and that he passed on his ministry to her as his partner and as his most trusted spiritual partner as well as his life partner. And of course, my book came out roughly the same time as Da Vinci Code, although I had written it many years before. And that's an interesting story because the publishing world would not take my book prior to the Da Vinci Code because it was too controversial.
Well, and that was going to be a question. This might be a good time to get into it, too. Is it inevitable that the story has been compared to the Da Vinci Code?
No, of course it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, that's a double-edged sword. It's a good thing. It's a bad thing. Sometimes it chafes a little bit because I've been doing this research for such a long time that I don't love it when people say, oh, well, it's like the Da Vinci Code. On the other hand, the Da Vinci Code is the most successful piece of fiction in history. So, I think that's probably a good thing. If you read the Da Vinci Code, believe me, you will love my book.
Yeah, and yet you submitted your manuscript before he did to publishers.
Long before. And I was told, the most interesting thing I was told on a number of occasions is, you can't write this book because you're a woman.
Oh, boy, are you kidding?
No, it absolutely turned out to be true. I was told it by agents. I was told it by publishers. They said it sounds too much like revisionist history. I was told that it sounded like feminist rage. There are all kinds of reasons that you can't tell this story from a woman's point of view. And so in that regard, Dan Brown really opened the door for me, because once the Da Vinci Code happened, I was able to go back to all those people and say, look, people are ready for this story. And then they said, well, now you're too late.
Oh.
But, of course, my book is very different from the Da Vinci Code. It covers the same ideas, but it takes it in a very different direction. It's like saying, if you write a book about the French Revolution, it's not necessarily a tale of two cities. There are a lot of different ways that you can tell the story. And my book has so much in-depth research and really looks at it from the point of view of women's history and the spirituality of women that has been eradicated in Europe and in the Western world, including the U.S., in the last 2,000 years. So it really goes into a different place than the Da Vinci Code.
What was again, maybe you've already answered it by saying what you did and just trying to get this published. What was the most difficult part of writing the stories? Was it the act of getting it published, number one, but then number two, I guess we should talk about the most difficult part of the process, and that would answer that question.
Well, I think the most difficult part of the process was trusting myself about what I was going to put on the page. Because when you're writing about Jesus, when you're writing about, such an extraordinary character and period of time that people around the world, that 2 billion people are completely connected to and have an idea about what this should look like, it's a very risky thing to do. And, my goal was not to offend anybody, but to open people's eyes to the fact that, look, whether or not you believe that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, 1 million people died for this idea. So let's look at it this way. So it was, for me, trying to figure out, what do I leave in, what do I take out? If I leave this in, there is a very controversial element about John the Baptist, for example, in The Expected One. And when I first wrote the book, I left it out because I thought, this is too controversial. People are not going to be able to deal with this concept, and I'm not going to leave it in. But then, I would lie awake at night thinking, this is a huge part of the story, and I believe this to be true based on the research and based on what I've discovered in France, so I have to put it back in. So there's a lot of that sort of spiritual and emotional tug-of-war that you have with yourself when you're writing about a subject that's so big. I'm happy to say that the rest of the books haven't had that much of a, they haven't been that difficult because they haven't been about such a huge subject.
Right.
But when you're writing about Jesus, it's very, very tricky.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's the thing that maybe the Da Vinci Code coming out when it did kind of protected you a little more from all of the extreme responses to that book. I mean, that was amazing. That was talked about, written about, about how terrible it was. Have you gotten any letters from any groups that don't like what you wrote?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's the good news. Start with the good news, which is 99% of the mail I get is amazing. I'm in 60 countries now. The expected one has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. It is in Hebrew, it's in Arabic, it's in 3 dialects of Chinese. It is everywhere, and I get amazing, amazing letters from people that say this book has changed my life. This book has brought me back to spirituality. A lot of people who have been really hurt by the Catholic Church in the last years have found a way to kind of come back to Jesus from a different angle without having to go through the church. So those are the people who I'm so grateful to hear from. But yes, to answer your question, I have had death threats. When the Book of Love came out, I had to cancel my book tour.
Unbelievable.
So I have definitely, the Book of Love was very controversial because of this idea that Jesus had written the gospel, and that the gospel alluded to this idea that God is both male and female, that essentially God has a wife. There was originally, from the Hebrew scripture, God had a wife. And so all of that was in the Book of Love. And there was definitely some resistance to that idea. And I went through some issues with both the expected one and the Book of Love in terms of death threats and that kind of thing, and a couple of really, really, really ugly things. But overall, people love and embrace this material, and you just have to keep going.
Yeah. So has that lessened off, or does that continue from time to time?
It's better now. I think that, and I also think that the world has changed in the last 6 years since the expected one first came out. When the expected one first came out, and the same thing with the Da Vinci Code, everyone was terrified of offending the Catholic Church.
Right.
Everyone was so worried about what the church response would be and how Catholics were going to feel about it. But I think the Catholic Church has been through so much with their own public relations issues.
Yeah.
That they have other things to do rather than looking at people like me.
Yeah, well, it also shows historically how things are covered up, and so that was the same, centuries ago is going on now. So I guess that makes sense that people wouldn't feel as strongly about it.
And absolutely, I also think what we're seeing with books like mine is that people are ready to hear the truth. I mean, people realize now that they have been lied to historically, and their minds are a lot more open. So, again, this has been an evolution over the last decade, but people have really come to the point of saying, you know what, I am ready to understand that the history books are not always accurate,
well,
the historians are not always accurate.
That's right. Have you had any interest from any of the movie studios?
Yes, I have, actually. There has been a lot of interest. Hollywood is a tricky place, and I grew up here. I was born in Hollywood and have worked for most of the studios, and it's getting a movie made is a very difficult thing. So we'll see. I don't have any announcements to make at the moment, but there is definitely a lot of talking happening. We're actually looking more towards the miniseries as opposed to the feature film because the books are so rich. There's so much material in them that we've had concerns about getting it made in 2 hours on a feature presentation. So we think that a miniseries might be the best bet for us.
Okay, very quickly, tell us what your favorite piece of Renaissance art is, because we're just about out of time. You got about 10 seconds. Quickly.
I'm a Botticelli girl, so I'm going to go with Primavera.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and I do hope you'll come back with your next book, and we have to take another break. Thanks you again, Kathleen.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Great to be here. We'd love to talk to you again.